In the name of the divine, whose presence permeates through all our being. In the foreverness of the joy of being lost and being found, travel the length of the same journey. Having arrived is no more than an expectation, where now defies its own self in the perpetuity of time. In anticipation, there loses its head, trying to escape the reality of the moment at hand. I'm going to present a thesis that is going to look at the entire conflict, not just from the Muslim-Christian perspectives, but rather from a global positioning, and especially in respect to where we are and where we could have been had things been different. That when the Muslim armies came to Spain, they were carriers of a message. Cultures that were militarily conquered and got enriched from the values that Muslims had brought with them. And the learning was passed on, not just from the Muslims to the non-Muslims in Iberia, but beyond into the rest of Europe. The medium for bringing this message was, of course, the language, and the language was Arabic. This is a Quran of that's written in the Andalusian style. This type of calligraphy was very unique only to Spain. As we know, there in the East, they developed the Nasr, the cursive. They also developed the Kufic style, which was used primarily for architecture and for designs and artwork. But in Andalus, they developed their own style, which is what we are looking at here. Public education was not just the command of God, but it had become a way of life for the Muslims before they moved to Iberia. So in Spain, little boys and girls had to start early on, and poor or rich, it didn't matter. When I mean public, they were public. Unlike the Christian children up north, where education was the lot of the privileged and the rich and the wealthy, obviously the few, in the south it became rather more common. After, of course, they went through their basic education, that became a medium for them to expand into the culture, into the lore, into the literature, into the poetry of the Muslims, which was exciting for the inhabitants, Muslims, Christian, Jews, whoever they were. It got to a point where people were no longer interested in studying Latin or anything that had to do with Latin, including the scriptures and the literature and whatever they may have had. We do have to understand that education was rather limited. At one point, a pious Christian had to sell 120 acres of land so he could buy a book, because the books were primarily written on papyrus, which was not only rare but also, of course, expensive, whereas the Muslims had brought paper from China in 751. The paper made Islamic knowledge accessible, available, and rather inexpensive. One of the great Christian libraries in the 9th century bragged about being the largest library, the largest Christian library, because they had 36 books. Whereas the Muslims at the same time had a library that had 500,000 books. And Al-Hakam is reported to have had his private library of 400,000, and they claim that he had read most of it. So there was just no comparison between the North and the South. That cultural divide was so overwhelming that people became either Muslim or they became Islamicized culturally. And this trend toward going for the values and cultures of those foreigners offended many of the Christians, especially those in leadership position, whether it was church or politics. Let me read you a letter. This is by Álvaro de Córdoba. He was a Christian scholar. My Christian fellows delight in the poems and romance of the Arabs. They studied the works of Mohammedan theologians and philosophers, not in order to refute them, but to acquire a correct and elegant Arabic style. Alas, the young Christian who are most conspicuous of their talents have no knowledge of any literature or language save the Arabic. They read and study with avidity Arabian books. They amass whole libraries of them at a vast cost, and they everywhere sing the praises of Arabian lore. The pity of it that Christians have forgotten their own tongue, and scarce one in 1,000 can be found able to compose in fair Latin a letter to a friend. But when it comes to writing Arabic, how many there are who can express themselves in that language with the greatest elegance and even compose verses which surpass in formal correctness those of the Arabs themselves. This was taken more not as a realm of efflorescence, a cultural efflorescence, but rather as an invasion from outside that threatened their culture. I think if we can draw an analogy, we could say that in some parts of the Muslim world today, people reject democracy because it's Western. And the West certainly doesn't help in claiming it as such, without realizing that democracy is a common human yearning. That is a natural desire of all humans to live under a government that is representing their views and their values. But when it's labeled as belonging to one or another culture, that's where sensitivities are aroused. And I think this may have been the case here in Spain as well. As a result of that, Arabic language got so enmeshed with the Spanish language, and I think it's not correct to call it Spanish, as there were many dialects, but regardless of that, of the Latin-based languages of the Iberian Peninsula, that would include Portuguese, Castellanos, and Aragonese and other dialects, is that today you can find up to 8,000 words of Arabic in Spanish that most Spaniards are not aware of. 2,300 names of places, and some of them get transferred over and over to areas beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Those of you who have gone to Mexico, for instance, have you heard the word Zócalo, which is the main square in downtown Mexico City? Zouk from the souk, the marketplace. Right. So the marketplace, souk, has become souk, and from souk, the local one, soukalo, and so there. We also hear in the news in places like, for instance, in Kiev, Ukraine, have you heard the word Maidan, the central town square? Yeah, that's an Arabic word, all the way into the Slavic languages. Along with this universality of the language, of course, came culture, and the culture was, as I said, started with elementary school, kindergarten, whatever the age may have been, and it permeated the society upwards. And along with it came the values that affected the norms of etiquette, manner, lore, formalities, and in particular in respect to women, for instance. In Christian Europe, the family law was the Roman law, that the wife was the property of her husband and was completely subjected to his disposition. He could punish her in any way he wanted to. I'm reading from the text of the law here, with the experts of it. And as far as family property is concerned, the wife herself did not own anything. Everything she or her children inherited belonged to her husband, including also the dowry which she brought with her to her marriage. Now, this being the state in the social setting of what a woman was in the non-Muslim world, in Europe I'm talking about, and it's perhaps because of that that when a woman got married, she had to become Mrs. somebody. In other words, she lost her name, whoever she was, that which we conveniently call the maiden name now. So the maiden name was given up, so the woman had to adopt her husband's name, and this would entitle the husband to everything that was in her name. By contrast, in the Muslim part, the woman had all the legal rights to property, which was unheard of in Spain, in Europe in general. And because of that, a woman had to keep her own name, whether she was married or single. She would carry her own name, her father's last name, her mother's last name, and then her husband's last name. Not one at the expense of the other, but all of them together. And perhaps some of you may have encountered our friends who come from Mexico, and when they're asked what their name is, she would give you a name like Maria Rodriguez Gonzalez de Toulouse. And so the Americans are saying, like, you know, how backward. These people don't even know how to respond to a simple question. I just asked her for her name and she gave me a whole sentence. But then say, no, ma'am, what is your last name? And she repeats the whole thing. The last name concept, as I said earlier, that was a European thing. So the Spanish Muslims were far more advanced because they, for legal reasons, they had to keep all those names. So in case the woman's father died, she could go to the court and say, look, here is my name, my last name, my father's last name is here, so I'm entitled to his property. And a Christian woman could not, because her name had already changed. And so in a way we are going backwards here, which we think is more advanced to have only one last name. It's the Spanish tradition, which is the Islamic tradition, which is the more progressive. And I don't think we had heard until Hillary became Rodham Clinton. This, as you see, is the Saint Jose shroud, and with pride they have the Kufic writing on the shroud, and he would have been obviously a Christian, but that didn't matter. The Latin writing didn't have the prestige. The Kufic did, and whether they embroidered it with silk or whatever other expensive material they have that showed the prestige. Here we have the Pseudo-Arabic. So for people who didn't know exactly how to write, it didn't matter. They made it look like Arabic. So this is Virgin Mary, and on her sleeve, all along, you can see the Pseudo-Arabic, which at one point had come as a special expensive material, where on the margin of the material, the textile, it was written La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. And when you write that Arabic, there are a lot of straight lines that kind of crisscross, and they perhaps could not decipher it, so they said, well, in order to make this material look expensive and make it worthy in this painting of Virgin Mary's sleeve, let's put that in there too. Here is another example of the Pseudo-Arabic script, and here you can see in the halo clearly what looks like Arabic, especially the motto, the declaration of faith. It's not Arabic, but because of the prestige, they had to include that in there. And here's one more, and now we are going for Kufic. Here you can see it on the hem of this painting of Jesus, Pseudo-Kufic hem again. And this would be a testimony to what I said earlier, is that because the cultures have kind of merged together to a point where the majority of the people were not really resisting it. They were accepting it. If any painting was anything, it had to show some Arabic writing. There's really so much you can talk about, but I just want to give you a glimpse of what Muslims had achieved. So this is Hunayn bin Ishaq's diagram of the eye. The difference was that up to that point in Europe, the common understanding and interpretation of how technically, scientifically, biologically we are able to see, it was believed that there was light inside the eye that was going out and was making things visible for us. And Hunayn came and said, no, it's the exact opposite. The light comes from outside into the eye and deflects, and the rest of what we already know by now. So that's how advanced they were. This is Ibn Khatib's pulmonary circulation diagram. The reason I'm showing you this is because, as I promised you earlier, that I'm presenting a thesis, so when you look at it in that context, you would know why or how was it even possible for the Muslim scientists to be so advanced. This is the Girey tile arrangement, that is the quasi-crystal order, which most people thought that, well, because Muslims are not allowed to show a presentation of a human face that may be attributed to God or to the Prophet. Therefore, because of that restriction, they have, developed this art form. But this art form is more of a science than it was art, because every line that bent was done based on a particular set of calculations. So you had to know algebra, math, geometry, to be able to design this. This is Abu Rayhan's world in the Ghaznavid Empire centered in Afghanistan. And he was able to find out the radius of the Earth. And again, it's a little detailed, which I will discuss in the contrastive part of it. And this is how he did it, by using the dip angle. And this is his formula. This was written back in the 10th and 11th century, at a time where Europeans were still writing their numbers in petrographs. But by contrast, we are looking at, like I said, Al-Biruni is not only making scientific observations, but he is also doing his calculations on algebraic formula, which in a way would be the forerunner of the MC square and the theory of relativity in a sense. That is science-based to its core. This is the Jalali calendar, which is the most accurate, the most scientific calendar in the world even today. And this one was devised back again in the 11th century. I'm quickly going through the images here. That is Ibn Rushd, his statue in Cordoba. And as I said before, he is commonly known as Averroes because the names had to be Latinized at least, so they won't look too offensive and too foreign and too intruding. But they do take pride in them. This is Ibn Rushd in Raphael's painting, the man with the turban at the center a little bit to the left. Ibn Musa ibn Maimonides in Cordoba. In other words, it shows the cultural confluence there. And this is Abu Ishaq Ibrahim Zarqali, who was the greatest scientist in spheres and astronomy. And the Spanish have honored him by putting him on a stamp recently. And speaking of stamps, there is one more from the old SSR, the Soviet Union, who have honored the 1000th anniversary of Abu Rayhan Biruni in 1973. This is Jing He, who is the admiral of the Imperial Ming Dynasty. He designed, developed, and navigated the world's largest navy, as you can see in the picture behind. This is a more recent painting, of course. Now compare that with the three little, what was it, Pinta, and Santa Maria, and Nina? La Nina. So there is just no comparison. Right after the expulsion of the Muslims, there was a kind of a power struggle between Spain and Portugal as to who was supposed to be the kind of the bearer of the banner for Christianity. Portugal was more advanced in navigation because they had more of a sea coast, and also I think 2 or 3 of their cities were good in constructing good ships. Spain had little of that, but still the problem was that Spain had expended its military power in expelling the Muslims, so Spain had become weaker. Portugal was much stronger. So here the Portuguese were trying to get the endorsement of the Pope that if anyone was to conquer the world for Jesus, it should be them. And so this resulted in a kind of a mediation where the Pope came in between, and 2 treaties were signed, Tordesillas, Saragossa, and these 2 treaties were signed kind of to separate the domain of the 2 states so that there won't be no infighting. Superimposed that, the principles of that treaty on today's map. It was declared that based on the first treaty, there was a line somewhere, I think 350 leagues west of Cape Verde, this line that you see here on the west that's cutting right through South America and Greenland. That to the west of that would be the area which Spain was going to conquer. and to the east of that will be the area for the Portuguese. Then came the second treaty of Saragossa, which is the green line on the far right, and that was the other side. So in a way, this is how the world was divided into half, and the whole campaign to conquer began. The age of exploration, colonialism, the Renaissance, and all of them weave into a kind of, in my opinion, a global fiasco, a disaster. And the disaster is for the following reasons. That at the time, China was a superpower in its own right. It was a world into itself. India was the superpower and the desired land that anyone wanted to. Remember, Columbus wanted to go to India because it was the land of all the riches. Africa was, if not equally advanced, wasn't that far behind. Remember all the gold that was expended when Musa, one of the rulers of Mali, wanted to go on a Hajj. He brought a caravan of camels loaded with gold to give as gift, and his sign of generosity for being a good Muslim. It got to a point where the gold market in Cairo collapsed. So Africa was not impoverished. And then the West, the Americas, were equally rich in their own way. In the process that began with Spain, first in terms of conquest, China was subjugated to the European will. 5 of its largest cities were taken away, and laws, commercial laws and others were imposed on them. And so China was brought to its knees. The superpower India, the land of prosperity, became a land of the poor and the destitute and the starving by the end of the period of colonialism when the British were leaving. Africa was plundered for its riches in terms of natural resources, but also in terms of human resources. And again, it goes back to the Pope's declaration that they may find it hard to convert Muslims, so it's okay to enslave them. Since you cannot enslave a Christian, it's okay to enslave a Muslim. So the slavery endorsement, again, is tied to their faith. So we impoverished Africa, India, and China, and we plundered and destroyed North and South America so that all the riches could find their way to Europe. And now Europe, and by extension North America, is taking pride in being so advanced. Of course they would be if you had 400 years of slavery where people worked for you for free. You would get rich. Yes, there are other causes which we could discuss politically, economically, and otherwise, but this is the main thrust of what happened. The other thing is that in the process, there was a cultural dimension. The Reos Católicos made it their mission to make sure every person becomes a Christian from cradle. And so that's why, as I told you in the last session, that not only were Muslims prohibited to use their language, to do prayers, and to keep their names, but they were not allowed to teach their own children. Muslims' children were taken away and were taught by Catholic priests. This was the only way they could reduce the overwhelming Muslim majority that in some cities reached 77%, to bring it down to Zero. So this forced conversion, forced indoctrination from early childhood became kind of a laboratory for them to do what we could call a human engineering, or engineering on the human psyche, brainwashing from birth, and imposing on them identities. And in these identities, the critical thing was they were very, very obsessive to the concept of names. You could not carry any name, you could not have any name that was either Arabic, Islamic, or in some ways related to the Muslim. If you take Spain as a laboratory of this fiasco that I referred to, this was superimposed on top of everything else that the age of colonialism and the age of discovery brought to the world. Now, I'm sure you've heard the Aborigines in Australia, whose children are taken and Christianized. I'm sure you've heard of people in Canada, the first people, whose children were taken by the Catholic Church to be Catholicized. And the same thing goes here in the United States. Even today, the largest number of a federal agency that's supposed to be protecting the family rights and the children's rights are strategically located in the neighborhoods where there's the majority of Native Americans. South Dakota, Arizona, New Mexico. And many of those families lose their children early on. And so when you destroy the fiber of the society from that early on, it's no wonder that the sense of alienation, social alienation in these communities is so high. Now, we could also talk about Africa, that if you think about the name of every African leader, the name is a Christian name. And what happened in the Philippines? I showed you a picture of Zheng He, the Chinese admiral. He was sailing through the western part of the Pacific Ocean, through Malacca, all the way down to the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. Now, as he went, he was a Muslim, of course. Everywhere he stopped, in a port of call, they start praying. And on top of being a Muslim, of course, he was the commander, so a lot of his sailors would have been doing the same thing. So most of these people in Indonesia and the Philippines adopted Muslim ways because they thought it was a new thing, a good thing. No Muslim soldiers has stepped into the archipelago in Indonesia, and yet Indonesia is the largest Muslim country today. The Philippines was all Muslim. So when it was claimed in the name of King Philip II, they were so happy that they had all these islands. But when they went close, they found out that they were Muslim. And so they sent a word back to them, what do we do? And he says, well, they have gone there too. Yes, so let's take care of them. So King Philip II commissioned a Portuguese admiral to Christianize, basically. But that would have been an impossible task for him to do. So at least he made sure that their names were changed. So in the Philippines, he went from north to south and changed everybody's name. He had a whole list alphabetically. In this sense, we can also add the Russian sensitivity to Islamizing Muslim names. So they call it a process of Russification under the Tsars, and Sovietization. But in essence, it stays the same thing, that in the entire Soviet empire, the only people who have to change their names are Muslims. So you go to Central Asia, and you hear in the news and on TV the name of President Islam Karimov. It has to have a Cyrillic ending that is gender sensitive for men and for women. So Muslims, even today in the former Soviet Union republics, are not allowed to have their own real names. They are all Russified. In that sense, I think there was a a great effort to Christianize the world. However, in recent times, for making it more quote-unquote politically correct, we don't use the word Christian, but we use Western. We use democratic or Western democracy, or the free world. But it all boils down to that one thing: it's the identity. And same thing goes with the immigrants that come to America. You see left and right people are adopting quote-unquote Christian names without being aware of it, that this social pressure that is created is rooted in a thing 500 years back in Spain. So, in my opinion, Spain was that laboratory in which these would-be colonial policies of re-identifying humans in a religious identity of the conqueror was established. That became a norm, and so now pretty much everyone does it around the world. Let me go to the chart that I have here. This is one of those one-if questions that we often ask in history. Sometimes it's idealistic, sometimes it's wishful thinking. But in here, I want to get out of the context of the Muslim-Christian thing here. What you see here in this chart on the screen, we start here at the bottom. It covers the period between 7/11 and 1969. And I've highlighted the major events here. So the Muslim culture as a civilizational power started with a thrust of its own. Very, very progressive and inclusive of Muslims, Christians, and people of all other faiths. So this goes at a very, very rapid speed until the fall of Toledo, where you see the red line, and that's the decline. And that bend there represents a period where scientists and scholars did not feel safe and comfortable, and were not so thoroughly engaged in scientific inquiry anymore because of the ever-present threat of the Christian armies from the north. One of the greatest scientists, Al-Khatib, whose father was killed by the Christians, and for a while he just gave up. He was so disoriented by the tragedy. But then he picks up and ends up writing 52 other books. And that was one of perhaps the last great Muslim scholar of his era. But from then on, it's downward. So then we go to the beginning of the Renaissance, which sort of begins simultaneously, because over on the Italian side, especially in Sicily, King Roger of Sicily, he was more amenable to the Muslim ways, more receptive, and he helped the scholars there. And so the Renaissance begins in Italy. And then in the fall of Granada, 1492, the speed of the Renaissance picks up a little bit more. Then we go to the end of Renaissance, just arbitrarily, 1648, and it goes all the way to, I used 1969, the landing of the moon, because we often refer to that as the greatest achievement in the Western culture. But what if I asked you that, could we have landed on the moon before that? What if I told you that we could have landed on the moon, this is not scientifically based, I'm just guessing, in 1717 or in the 1600s? Yes, it was possible. And it was possible for the following reason. I believe that the universal Islamic civilization, if it had been allowed to progress the way it did, Now, not necessarily only by Muslims, but by other Europeans too, if they had joined through a peaceful means, not necessarily by war, not necessarily taking the land for Jesus, but saying, look, there's a culture, they have a way of life that we admire, that we can make use of. Instead, they went the other route, which I just explained through colonialism and the Age of Discovery. But if it had been allowed, it would have made it possible for us to land on the moon in the 1600s, but certainly by the mid-1700s. Let's start here at the bottom. Fernas designed his flight machine in 888. Leonardo da Vinci did his in 1488. Whose was more advanced, you think? Leonardo's was a sketch. You know, he earned the title of the Renaissance man of Medici, Italy. But Fernas was not just a design, not a sketch. It was a practical thing. He flew it himself. Of course, didn't fly too far. He felt and hurt himself, but he survived. The red numbers showed the gap between the two, and in this case, it's exactly 500 years. So Leonardo da Vinci lived in the body of Fernas, or the other way around, by a gap of what I call the gap of retardation. The world was retarded scientifically for the global interest. This has nothing to do with Muslim or Christians. We'll go to the next one. So now we are talking about evolution. The Islamic theory of evolution was presented by Ali ibn Muskawiya in the year 950. Charles Darwin's 1882. How many years of difference? 932 years. When Ibn Muskawiya came with the idea, what was the reaction of the world? Total acceptance, embracing, and endorsement. Because it did not contradict anything in the Islamic belief systems where that which stands to reason is part of your faith. But when Charles Darwin suggested, to this day, I'm talking about the 21st century, nearly 50% of Americans do not believe in the theory of evolution because it offends them religiously. Not so the Muslims. The next one is the Al-Biruni that I showed you the diagram of finding the Earth radius in the year 1048. And that would be in modern Afghanistan, and I believe that at some point when the central part of the Muslim state, empire, Khilafah, whatever you want to call it, it kind of cooled off, but this fire of learning and attaining to a higher level of knowledge was burning hotter on the peripheries. So we take Afghanistan at the far east and then Spain in the far west. Al-Biruni discovered the Earth radius in 1048, and Isaac Newton did it in 1727. The gap between the two of them is how many years? 679. Now, who was closer to the actual side, I mean the radius? The figure that Newton came up with was off by 835 kilometers. And Al-Biruni, 31 kilometers. So Al-Biruni's figure was 6,339.6 kilometers, and Newton's was 5,536.1. When Newton found this number, he was working it with the theory of gravity, of course. Things didn't work. And it took him 20 years to rectify his mistake. Now imagine if these two cultures would not have been sensitive to one another. The genius of Newton would not have been wasted for 20 years to figure out the number that already existed before him 679 years earlier. Now imagine how much more he could have built on that. How much more would have humanity benefited from that? More. I've used examples that could be considered comparable to show that all of that which has been achieved since the Renaissance, and we take so much pride in it, that this Renaissance, the re part of it is more important, is that something has already been killed and destroyed, so it required a rebirth. And my point is that, alas, that we couldn't keep the first one, that if there had been efflorescence, Muslim, Christian, Jew, and of all traditions, without the zealotry of religion, then we would have been far too advanced. Now, Khayyam's calendar, which is called the Jalali calendar, was established in 1048, and this is the most scientific one because it is not centered on Earth, but on the solar system. It's called the solar transit. So based on that solar transit, it's not automatically the new year, for instance, which comes up this coming Thursday. It's not going to be at exactly 12 o'clock as we do with the Gregorian calendar. It's going to be at, I think, 9:57 and 07 seconds. That exact. And I could go into a whole lot of detail, but time would not allow. But this is how accurate that calendar was, which also accommodated the Coptic calendar, the Hindu calendar, the solar calendar, the lunar calendar, all in one. So when Pope Gregory recommended that they adjust the Julian calendar in the West in 1582, they simply built on the Jalali calendar. It's still not as accurate. So a difference of 503 years. We move further up to Zarqali in 1087. He was a man of talents, spheres, astronomy, and he had developed what are called the Toledo tables. And these tables are like, for public display, where people could in other words, the sciences were accessible to the masses. And Copernicus is the only one who acknowledges him. But again, that's a gap of 456 years. We go to Ibn al-Nafis for the circulation, and William Harvey, again, 1288 to 1657, 369 years of gap. And then Lisanuddin ibn Khatib in medicine, especially in the area of contagion, which came at the time of the Black Plague, which destroyed Europe. And yet they had these great physicians in Muslim Spain whose ideas could have been used, but the religious barrier prevented them from, and that's why most European cities lost a quarter to a half of their population, because they didn't know the concept of contagion. I'll give you just one more example, which is the crystals, and this is in respect to a Nobel Prize that was awarded recently for crystals, and the Swedish Academy was finally willing to acknowledge that the prize was given based on the discoveries of quasi-crystals in the molecular structure of a period in which the mosaics were designed in Alhambra and in Darb Imam Shrine in Iran. And I received some time ago an email in which they listed all the great Jewish and Christian Nobel laureates, and they say, where are the Muslims? Well, the Muslim Nobel laureates lived at a time when they didn't have the Nobel equivalent. And those who are winning the Nobel Prizes today, in a way, are standing on the shoulders of the Muslim scholars. I want to leave you with this thought that if we learn anything from Spain, it's not the 800 years of history, but rather to understand it, how much humanity has lost. That imagine if we had landed on the moon in 1717, where would we be now? Had we followed on their footsteps without interruption and without retardation and without making this U-turn, as you can see in the diagram here. And I think this should be the way we have to approach, is that when we talk about Western civilization, that it has brought calamity on humanity, that has retarded the world community of scientific inquiry and scientific discoveries by at least 5 centuries. These numbers average at 555. But imagine on top of that, India would not have been destroyed. China would have been there. Africa would have been prosperous. We would have learned from the Aztecs and the Mayans. But somehow this European mind was so obsessed with book burning, not from the time of Alexandria or the Greeks, but the only 3 books we got from the entire continent of America were when a conquistador was commissioned to burn the libraries. He burned everything, and when he wanted to walk away, he found that there was 1 book lying out there that wasn't burned, but then the fire was gone. So he picked that one up. And there were 2 others. So we got only 3 books from the Americas. Now, of all the libraries we talk about in Andalus, and these people were, like I showed you some of their work, was way, way too advanced for the Christian North in Iberia to understand. And yet they were willing to have ceremonies for book burning. And so you can imagine how much of that has been lost. And so when we talk about Western civilization, I think of Gandhi's famous quotation, "It's a good idea." So I'll stop here for any questions. Thank you.
What happened to the Muslim mind? And please don't tell me colonialism and occupation. Why that ingenuity stopped or deteriorated and it became like the dark ages of Europe as far as our thinking is concerned?
Well, 2 things. One, that, as you can see in this graph, when Muslims became, occupied the center stage in global politics and science and learning and religion, they got attacked by 3 crusades I referred to last time. The crusade through the Iberia, the crusade through the Balkans, and the crusade through east of Russia, through Kazan and the Ural Mountains. So there were 3 crusades. On top of that came the Mongols. And every civilization has its rise and fall. And I'm positing this theory in a context where if that torch had been passed on, it may or may not have been passed on to Muslims. I'm saying the Europeans could have picked up on that without going to war and had built on Muslim sciences without the 500 interruptions. So it could have been a Christian civilization. I mean, they would have been Christian scientists, but it would have benefited humanity in much the same way, but centuries earlier. That's the argument. So one would have been the normal cycle of the rise and fall of any civilization, and no civilization is immune to that. And the second thing is all these major attacks that came upon the Muslim world, and they were the most devastating one that we know.
So Muslim rule, they spent so many years, and after they kicked out, nobody left for do the adhan. What is the reason?
I'm centering this only on Spain because it left enough an opportunity, enough material for the Christians to build on afterwards. But the Muslims had many Spains. India was as advanced, the Ottomans were, and there were many other states. But let's look at the way the Portuguese approached the, what was it, the Cape of Good Hope, which should probably be named the Cape of Bad Omen. Because when they got into the Indian Ocean, they went and destroyed every port city along the east coast of Africa, all the way to Arabia, crossed over to India, and they got into the Indian Ocean where there were Chinese ships, Indians, Arabs, Persians, everyone was trading with each other. This was like a free trade zone, and people were showing off what they had produced in these elegant, beautiful ships. And the Portuguese come with huge guns on their ships and start sinking this one, that one, and the other one, and everyone says, like, what's going on? Well, because they didn't have anything to offer. So after they just, and the other ships were, of course, there for trade and business. They didn't have guns on the decks to fight back. The end result was that Portuguese, all of a sudden, this tiny European country got a monopoly and named every one of those cities, like Diego Garcia and so on and so forth, put Portuguese flag, and they established a monopoly of starting with pepper. Okay? Nobody could sell or buy pepper except the Portuguese. I'm just giving you one example. And so they were there for the loot, because the sea was not safe anymore. So this state-sponsored piracy became the norm.
During any crisis, there is usually people who rise to the occasion and challenge the establishment. At any time during these periods, was there any attempt or any communication from the other side, trying to mend bridges and figure out things such as dialogue?
The two cultures did not speak the same language. As I said, the Muslim culture was called Islamic out of the necessity because the Christians called themselves Christian. The Muslims didn't have a pope. They were not driven by the idea of converting people into Islam. For those of you who have read Jack London's Love of Life, I think in the last paragraph he writes something to the effect that this man who was starving and near death and was saved, when he was finally saved, he was hoarding. That if he had lunch here, he would put food in his pockets and he will put it in the mattress and he will put it in everywhere there was bread, because he had starved. He was near starvation. I think Europe experienced something like that, that the Muslim civilization expanded so much that Europe became an isolated enclave in a cold place in the northwestern part of that world there. So it was this deprivation, that they had been hungry and starving, so much that, remember, they went after the spice and the food and the coffee, etc., etc. So it was this starvation which was sort of unleashed with a vengeance, not just on the Muslims, but on the entire world.
The most prominent Christian and Jewish scholars were at the same time contemporary to the most prominent Islamic thoughts in Andalusia. You know what I'm talking about, Thomas Aquinas and Maimonides, whom actually credited with the Reformation in both Christianity and Judaism was happening in Spain. So there was a culture of openness, and that not necessarily exclusive to the Muslim, and it's probably lent itself to the Reformation later on.
When the Umayyads lost power in the east, they came with a sense of trying to compete with Baghdad. So every city they built, there was this sense of competition. And this competition was not just political, because the political level, Abdurrahman II, for example, he wanted to double and triple any monetary reward to any scholar, philosopher, scientist that Baghdad would offer. He would say, I'll give you double, but come over here. Because Baghdad was the hub, the center of the world. And people wanted to go there. They didn't want to go to the periphery, far out flank over there in Spain. So he had to pay a high price for this competition. The second thing was that it went from the state level to the public level. And scholars in the West would write their theses, their papers, and their books, and send them east. And scholars in the East would read them and respond to them and disagree or agree with them, and then they will send them west. Kind of internet of their time, a web, where these ideas would be read all along as they came west. And people would say, oh, great answer, wonderful thought, and let's see what we get. So a few months later, the response will come from Spain down to Morocco and Algeria, and it will be going east, and people will be reading in each town, reading the responses to what was written by Al-Ghazali 4, 5, 6 months ago. And then people will be expecting, okay, let's see what the response will be. So this thing went back and forth, and so it was educating people. So the townships, or the concept of academia that the Greeks had established for the few, became the public square for, let's call it a university in its true sense, without tuition. So when these letters and these manuscripts and these thoughts were read to the public, it educated everyone, and it was in this sense that there was an efflorescence. I didn't mention anything about a spiritual thought. So when we had Ibn al-Arabi in the West, we also had back in the East Hujwiri in Afghanistan. And so they were expressing similar ideas. A lot of these dialogues went back and forth, and people who would listen to these would then find out, I like this person's idea. They would travel thousands of miles to sit at the foot of a great scholar who they had admired from all these readings. So there was a whole lot of this communication going on. I think that was responsible for making the Islamic culture more universal. And the idea that you mentioned of Thomas Aquinas and Maimonides was that it was Ibn Sina's idea that we could incorporate Aristotelian argument with religion and faith. In other words, that reason and revelation don't necessarily have to oppose. And this was an absolute no-no in Europe. So when they kind of established this academically in Spain too, then the Christian scholars came around and say, well, if they can do it, maybe we can do it too. So Thomas Aquinas was one of those who kind of tapped onto this Islamic thought, which resulted in the Reformation. So in a sense, not only the Protestant Reformation, but Renaissance in itself is actually the same knowledge that the Muslims had brought, except they rebranded it. And my idea is that it's this rebranding that did us in and resulted in the 5th century retardation.
I promise this is...